Welcome to this lesson on file I/O and more specifically about reading. So what is a file? A file is a computer resource for recording data discretely in a computer storage device. So what does this mean? Well, let's think of it kind of like a piece of paper. A piece of paper that has writing on it can be thought of as a simple file because it is a storage device for our text. The same idea is done in a computer. We are restoring data in memory. Now with a piece of paper, we can usually do two different things with it. We can either choose to be using it for reading, or we can be using it for writing. So what we're going to look at today is reading. And to start off with that, we have to think about where this all begins. Now if I want to read a piece of paper, the first thing I'm going to need to do is find it within a stack of another paper or other documents. For instance, let's say I'm going to be looking for a document called animals. I'm going to look through my stack of papers until I find it, let's say here, and then I'm going to remove that piece of paper for the purpose of reading. Once I have my piece of paper on its own, I can choose to read it in three separate ways. When I'm really young, such as when you were first beginning to read, you might read it character by character. This is the simplest way to read it. As you get older, you'll choose to read things word by word, and continue to read faster and faster. Now, some people who may be more and more experienced will start to read things line by line. This is not generally applicable to most humans, however, it is applicable to our computer programs which can do this. There is one more thing that we're going to require in order to read, and that is a human. The two things that they require is their eyes in order to be able to see said text. However, that's not enough since we also need to be able to interpret the text, which means that we will require our brain. When we talk about this with computers, we are talking about using three different things: a file reader, a buffered reader, or the scanner, which we've already used in the past for input. So let's take a look at what these look like when we're coding. Okay, so let's take a look at reading from a file. There are a couple things we're going to need to do before we jump into the coding portion itself. So what we're going to start with here first is a couple of imports, namely java.io. and then add an asterisk. This is used to import all of the IO functions that are needed in order to import files and such in order to read them. We're also going to import java.util. And the reason for this is because we are going to be using a scanner, and that is situated in the util. I also could have just imported java.util.scanner. That also would have been acceptable. Now, in order to use a file, unfortunately, we also have to add one more thing before we get started. In our public static void area, we are going to need to add something that says throws IO exception. The reason for this is that if something happens with our file, such as it gets deleted while we are working on it, we need to be able to throw an IO exception accordingly. So now let's take a look at reading from a file. The first one we talked about that we would use for reading was a file reader. To start off, I'm going to create a file reader called input_stream, and I'm going to assign it to the value null. The reason I am assigning it to the value null is because if the file does not exist, I want to make sure that I have a default value for my input stream. Next, we're going to use something we haven't experienced before called the try catch. So first, the try section, what we're going to do here is we're going to have try followed by some braces. What this means is that anything within these two braces will be attempted. However, if they fail, what we want to do is instead of letting our program crash due to something such as an exception like we had before, we are going to use something called a catch statement to make it so that that exception does not crash our code. The exception we're looking for in this case is the IO exception, as we have stated above. So now let's look at the body of our try part. We're first going to create our input stream by saying input stream equals new file reader. And in the brackets, we are going to put the name of the file we want to read. Now, if you notice over here, we do have the file over here. And if I click on it, I have a bunch of text right here that I am going to read. If this file does not exist, you will instead get an IO exception, and you will have to catch that. We'll talk about that in a second. Next, what we're going to do is I'm going to create an integer called c. This is because file readers normally will read character by character. However, since it is going to use their Unicode values, it is not going to give us a character value, it is going to give us an integer value. After that, we're going to create a loop in order to read things from our file, in this case a while loop, that will stop when our condition becomes false. Our condition is checking that the input stream.read is not equal to -1. Now you'll notice that I have also assigned this to a character inside the while loop. This is so that C will get the character that is being used for read, while read will also be checked if its value is -1 at the same time. -1 is the value that is returned when you have reached the end of the file and there are no more characters in the file to read. Next, I'm going to output the integer, plus I'm going to add a string or a space after it so that you can see the difference between each of the values that it's going to receive. That integer value will be the Unicode value of the character that was read. Next, we'll add our catch. Remember, the catch is what will happen if we get this exception. Inside the brackets of my catch, I'm putting IOException and followed by E. IOException being the exception I am going to get, E being the variable that I am giving it. Inside the body of the catch, we are going to print what we want to do instead of throwing the exception and crashing our code. In this case, I'm just going to print out IOException instead of having my code crash. There's one more part that we can add to this, and this is the finally. Finally is what will run after the try and catch. Remember, in try and catch, it is kind of like an if-else statement. The try will work, but if it crashes midway through, it will go to the catch. If the try statement does not crash in any way, the catch will instead be skipped. Regardless of which one of these two pathways our code takes, we are always going to go through the finally afterwards. In this case, the finally, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to close the file. In this case, to do that, what we're going to do is say if the input stream is not equal to null, keeping in mind that back at the beginning, we made it null before, so that we'd have a default value if it crashed on this very first part due to this file not existing. If it is not null, in other words, if we did open a file, we want to close it by saying input stream.close, so that our file reader closes and we are no longer accessing the file anymore. If I choose to run this right now, what we'll get here is a long line of characters, all on different lines since we use println. If I instead use print, if I take out the println, you'll notice now that I get them all on one long line with spaces between them. This is every single character within our text file over here, and each single one is the Unicode value that is given. So for instance, 73 is the Unicode value for a capital I, whereas 110 is the Unicode value for lowercase n. 32, you'll notice, pops up a lot because it is the Unicode value for a space. Next, let's take a look at a different reader. We are going to be looking at a buffered reader, which works a little bit differently than a file reader. Most of the code will be relatively the same. We'll start with our try. Inside our try, we're going to create a buffered reader. However, you will notice something a little strange here. In this case, we have not just put new buffered reader file followed by the file name, like we did up here for our file reader. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to put a file reader inside it to open, and then send that into a buffered reader. Next, we'll create a string instead of an integer here, since a buffered reader can read whole strings at a time. And then we'll create our while loop, which will be a little bit different. Our while loop will say L equals input stream.readLine, and then say as long as it is not equal to null. Just like it did before, we are going to assign the read line to a variable so that we don't lose the value. However, we are also going to check it against null, because we will receive null if we are at the end of the file. Next, I'm going to print the line out, so I'm going to print out the entire line at once. And then follow that up with our catch, which we are going to print out IOException, and our finally, which is going to close the input stream if it is not equal to null, just like we did before. If I run this one, unlike previously, what will happen, notice how I'm using println, each of my lines has a new line between it. This means that each time I go through my while loop, I am reading a whole line of my text document instead of just a single character or a single word. Finally, let's take a look at the scanner. So we're going to do the same process we did before. We're going to create a scanner, we're going to call it S, and we're going to make it equal to null. Next, we're going to do our try, and inside our try, we're going to create our scanner saying S is equal to new scanner, which has a buffered reader inside of it, which has a file reader inside of it. This is all the same process we did before. We are just adding extra layers so that we have extra functionality in the way that we are reading from our file. Next, we're going to do a while. However, this will be a little bit different. We're going to say while s.hasNext. What this does is it will give me a Boolean value back of whether or not there is another word inside of our file. HasNext will check between different delimiters, including space and new line. So let's print out each.sNext. Notice how I'm not assigning anything in my while statement. That is because hasNext does not actually take anything from the file to read yet and move on. It will just check to see whether or not the next part is valid. We will then do a catch for the IO exception and are finally to close the scanner just like we did before. Now, .next will go word by word as opposed to line by line. So in other words, if I run this, you'll notice that I get each single word on a different line, unlike with the buffered reader where I was reading the whole line at once. If I wanted to do print instead of println, I will get every single word on the exact same line. You also notice that there is no spaces between any of the words. This is because .next will remove the spaces and will just take in each word individually. If you want those spaces, you'll have to add them in on their own, like so. There are a couple other things you can do with scanners. Most notably, we have hasNext double, where we can check something if something will be a double. If it is, then we can read in next double on it, which means that we can store it as a double instead of a string like we have been so far. We can use hasNextInt, which will check if it's an integer. If it is inside, we can use nextInt in order to get an integer instead of a string. HasNextString does not exist since everything is already a string, so in other words, next will do this for you instead of having to write hasNextString. HasNext is used to check if there is anything at all. It will read it in as a string, and will use spaces and new lines as delimiters between them in order to differentiate between words. The scanner is especially interesting because it allows you to check whether or not you have booleans, doubles, ints, or strings that are coming up. It also means that you can read from something that you know if it's predefined in a certain way, such as if you have a file that is going to read a name, then an age, then a student number for a student, for instance. I know that it will always go in this order, so I can just check to see as long as it is one of these, I will bring it in as one of them. So in other words, if it is a string, I know it's a name. If it's an integer, I know it's a name. If I know it, let's say it's a long, maybe for the student number, then I'll know that I've gotten a student number, etc. That concludes this lesson on reading from files. Thank you for watching and have a great day.